Americans, I need you to become indifferent to martial law, okay? Because they're using it in order to restrict you from coming out to the streets and protesting peacefully, right? What I heard about April 5th, particularly from Gen Z, is that what happens if martial law is invoked? Martial law will be invoked whenever he wants to invoke it. Our government is belligerent, which means it's unpredictable, and ultimately it's existing as a toxic partner that is using martial law and violence from the government, which they will do anyways because they're already thinking of sending US citizens to El Salvador. So they're thinking of the right? The violence, they're thinking of it. You not showing up to protest against this government because of martial law isn't going to help him not invoke martial law. He's just going to do it in a different way. And being so hyper vigilant about martial law, which he can do whenever, because that's what happens if you have a toxic partner and they tell you, if you leave, I'm gonna harm you. Okay, but if you stay, they're gonna harm you anyways. So at this point, we have to become indifferent to martial law and allow for him to invoke it whenever he pleases, but ensure that when he invokes it, it's for something legal like peacefully protesting, because only then can other countries think of responsibility to protect. Google that. But in being so paranoid about martial law, it's deterring us from actually resisting. And as a result, our courts are being suffocated by who? The appeals court. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit temporarily halted U.S. District Judge James Boasberg's contempt proceedings against the DT administration. So the appeals court, which decided on a 2-1 decision, guess what the 2 was? It was Trump appointees to halt it. Why? They're obviously going to utilize some legalese that's an excuse for delaying it. They said it's intended to provide sufficient opportunity for the court to consider the government's appeal, which is the same appeal they've been doing. Rather, what we're seeing is that these Trump appointees and appeals court judges in general have been promoting the best interests of their king, the one who put them in that seat. That is judicial treason. Of course, that doesn't exist in the Constitution right now. But when we think of how we rebelled, when we think of the Constitutional Convention, when we think of the fact that we're going to move forward with what? Legal treason for attorneys and law firms, corporate treason for the corporations, resulting in things such as nationalizing SpaceX, nationalizing Starlink, nationalizing EM's companies so that there can be restitution for the Americans who have suffered under his Doji scam. Military treason for the soldiers who, as active soldiers, voted for someone who attacked the Constitution because they believed that when they vote, they were off the clock and didn't have to defend the Constitution. When the Citizens Almanac tells us that even as citizens, it is our duty to protect the Constitution. So the fact that they went against it, even as soldiers, means that they shouldn't be in our military. And we shouldn't pay for them to get benefits when they literally betrayed the country. And now we have what? Judicial treason. These are the judges who are actively aiding and abetting this government and circumventing the United States Constitution. What the appeals court is giving them is time. Delay, delay, delay. Now, these judges are Judge Gregory Katsas and Naomi Rao, who ruled for the administration. U.S. District Judge James Boasberg said that at this point, I just don't think I have the power to do anything about it. He refers to the Scottish ruling that allows for him to utilize the Aliens Act. So what we're seeing is a judicial coup that started from way before, right? From way before when Scottish decided on what? Trump versus Anderson. When Scottish decided on what? Immunity. When we allowed for someone who attacked the Constitution to position people in our appeals courts and our court in general, whose sole point is to exist as uplifters of his administration and his policies and his agenda, and actually safeguarding him in the legal process by allowing him to delay and circumvent contempt charges. And this is the thing, because you ask yourself, well, how do we get the courts to rectify themselves to be independent? And that comes at the people. That comes at us. But if we're too scared of martial law, if we're too scared of what the government may do if we resist, then we won't resist. And what's going to happen if we don't resist? What's going to happen is that this will continue because the judges will continue continue to work misaligned to their actual job. Now, we just have to look at South Korea to understand that that president would not have been impeached had the South Koreans not showed up and pushed and forced their government to actually rectify the wrongdoing. We do not. We listen to the courts and the judges and the appeal judges, and when they say whatever, even if it's overreach of their actual statute, which is constitutional safeguarding, we just accept it because law is complicated, so we just assume that they know what they're doing. But no, what has been occurring is a judicial coup, and this is what has allowed for the constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis would not exist without the courts failing to uphold the constitutional supremacy, right? And I'm gonna attach the constitutional supremacy video when it comes to Article 6 supremacy clause because there's a lot of misunderstandings with that. And the reality is that there's nothing above the Constitution, in fact. Federal Law 78 by Alexander Hamilton. The judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. So why is it so powerful? Why is it capable of rewriting the Constitution? Chief Justice Chase Salmons said that the Amendment 14, Section 3 was not self-executing. Why? Not because the Constitution said so, but because he personally thought it was too harsh on the South, on the Confederacy. See, the duty of the courts must be to declare all acts contrary to the manifest voice of the Constitution void, so null. Without this, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. See, the appeals courts are utilizing legalese and promoting, delay through legal channels that they know won't be questioned. Like, we need time to, consider this appeal. But this strangulation of the rule of law will ultimately lead to the constitutional collapse, and in reality, the courts themselves will lose legitimacy, and in reality, the union will fall. And I need us to understand that that rot that allowed for the constitutional crisis wasn't the legislature, it wasn't Congress, all right? It wasn't the executive, it wasn't the people, it was the courts, and particularly it was the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Particularly the conservative ones, because ultimately they position that they are much more an oath to their conservative ideology than the Constitution, because the Constitution itself is progressive. I don't say that, it just is. The Second Amendment was literally non-traditional provision that no one else had. So we are constantly trying to progress. But in our reality, the courts should not have a politicization. What they should have is a dedication to the moral compass of American constitutionalism. What we see here is that the appointees of Donald Trump that he inputs into the appeals courts are reigning in alignment with their king. In a future reality, this will be considered judicial treason, and that will result in the complete dissolution and replacement of the judicial branches, just like it will of Congress and just like it will of the administrative state. We're going to get rid of all the rot and ensure that this never happens again. But that starts with us not fearing martial law. We have to become indifferent to it, not numb, indifferent, because we're walking on eggshells, and the more that we are scared of martial law, the less that we resist. And the less that we resist, the more that we won't have any influence over how long this lasts. And this can last anywhere from as long as we want it to over 70 years, because they're utilizing the same channels that Mexican government used the Conservative Party, PRI, in order to control the Mexican three branches for over 70 years. So if you think that just voting is going to signify that it's going to be fair, you are wrong. We need to stop being deterred by martial law, and we need to focus on just resisting. We shouldn't be trying to figure out when is he going to do his next big harm against the people, because it's going to be every day. You know that.